Good afternoon. I'm Gabriella.
I'm Nisha.
I'm Devia.
I'm Myelin. And I'm Isabella.
And we're going to be presenting the effects of raising the minimum wage.
Okay, so our problem was the minimum wage has not been raised since 2009, and based off our research, we found that the minimum wage does need to be raised, but only to a certain extent.
So before we talk about the effects, I'm going to give a little bit of background. The minimum wage was established in 1938 by the Fair Labor Standards Act and has been an ongoing debate ever since. An important thing to consider when looking at this is inflation. Inflation, as you can see, has changed the graph significantly. The minimum wage has been $7.25 since 2009, and if you look at the graphs as a whole, you can see that the unadjusted wage has been pretty steady, and the adjusted wage has been very turbulent.
Okay. To raise the... Okay, so in 1968, the value... To raise the... Oh, sorry. Okay. For the value of the minimum wage to go to what it was like in 1968, it would have to increase to $10.10 per hour. So, obviously, the value of the dollar in the US has changed over time. So as time goes by, it's natural for the general prices of goods and services to increase. Hence, making adjustments to the minimum wage according to price change would be reasonable. Therefore, minimum wage and the general prices of goods and services go hand in hand. So when you look at this cartoon, what do you see? Well, the man represents wages, which is just above sea level. And this means that the wages, it's safe enough right now, but if inflation, which is the shark, is not taken into account, there will be drastic consequences. Also, the head is just above the water. So this depicts how the minimum wage just barely supports a family. And if inflation hits, then things will go downhill and there will be repercussions.
So now I'm going to talk about the effect on employment. Raising the minimum wage will have different effects for differently skilled workers. As stated by David Newmark, who is an expert in the field, according to the standard model of competitive labor, raising the minimum wage will lead to job loss among lower skilled workers, and this is due to two reasons. One is because employers will replace expensive, low-skilled labor for more profitable investments, such as machinery. The second is because higher wage will mean higher price, which in turn reduces demand. Newmark explained that among low-skilled workers, a reasonable estimate based on the evidence is that current minimum wages have directly reduced the number of jobs by about 100,000 to 200,000. One study done found that as many as 7.5 million jobs are at risk for replacement in the next 10 years. This figure will only grow if it stays in this condition.
Okay, so small businesses would also be affected by the raise of minimum wage. For example, higher wage would drop as employees would want to stay at a job where they're getting paid more, which would in turn decrease the turnover rate. The turnover rate is the rate at which old employees are leaving their company and new employees are being brought in. However, this could also lead to, since the minimum wage would be raised, some small companies would have to be forced to lose some of their employees because they couldn't break even with the amount being spent on wages and the amount being spent on the prices of the amount that the prices are bringing in, which could lead to prices being raised. However, this leads to one to two scenarios. One being that the company simply gets rid of all the employees that it can't afford to, and it just does in order to break even. The other scenario is that since more people would have higher wages, they would be able to afford the products and would thus increase the amount that people are spending on the products and how much they're bringing in, which could in turn lead to the small companies being able to keep some to all of their employees and perhaps even increase their workforce. Entry-level jobs would also be affected. The Employer Policy Institute found that when the minimum wage raises, less available jobs for entry levels are available and also with workers. This is because owners have to train the new employees to do the work of a higher skilled worker without them knowing beforehand because they haven't had the training yet, while still paying them the higher price, which would lead to owners wanting to hire people with experience and not wanting to hire those that didn't really have experience.
Okay, so in comparison to small businesses, major corporations such as Target, Walmart, Costco do not undergo major changes in employment because they have such a large labor force. But, well, I mean, okay, but moving on to a positive effect, it does increase the credibility of the companies because minimum wage laws guarantee taxpayers that businesses are playing fair and compensating workers at proper levels and that they're treating them properly. And they also benefit from the raise because it reduces their competition from small businesses. So take into example Costco and Sprouts. They do sell organic stuff, both of them, but Sprouts is much smaller and Costco, they have more branches around the country. And also, moving on to a negative point, it cuts into traffic growth, which basically means that it impacts the health of a business. So major businesses are usually spread across the nation or even the globe, and they have lots of branches here and there. So if you increase the minimum wage, and that cuts into the traffic growth and lowers the depth perception of the company in the eyes of its investors.
Okay, so the cost of living have become closer to reach because the change in price would be more gradual than the rise in minimum wage, allowing people to catch up and pay off some of the accumulating debt or loans with the increased pay. Now, for increased productivity and higher spending, so a raise in the minimum wage would serve as a way of motivation for workers to increase productivity, right? And also, the higher spending would result from being paid more, which allows people to have more money to spend. Both the increased productivity and higher spending would result in a balance for the money that has gone out to pay for wages. And in the ripple effect, wages near the minimum wage would also rise with it. This means that 30% of the American labor workforce's wages would also increase.
Okay. Now, it appears that a significant portion of the costs from raising the minimum wage can, in fact, be absorbed by businesses. For example, in the food industry, the wages that they pay their workers make up only a fraction of the total cost of running a business. And due to that, minimum wage increases and increases in price do not have a one-to-one ratio. One 2015 study in the San Jose area found that restaurants only increased the prices on their menus by 0.58% for every 10% increase in the minimum wage. This difference between increase in price and increase in minimum wage means that low-wage workers will have more money to spend. More spending money will drastically benefit the working class. Almost 1/3 of minimum wage workers have children, and 88% are over the age of 20. So by increasing the minimum wage, you increase the amount of spending money that the working class has, and in turn, increase the standard of living.
All right, so before we get into the details of this, I want to mention that minimum wage depends on low wage workers, and poverty depends on family income. So the extent to which poor families benefit from the raise is not necessarily dependent on how much the minimum wage is, because, for example, if you have a family that has one person working and they're earning the minimum wage, whereas another family that has two people working but they're earning the same minimum wage, the other person's family's income is much higher. So the minimum wage doesn't really affect how much poverty. It doesn't really reduce or raise the amount of poverty. And the Earned Income Tax Credit says that lowered labor costs for employers does increase the salaries for eligible workers. But every dollar earned for poor people is also a dollar earned for the businessmen, and that in turn doesn't really change the ratio that they're making.
Now, there are some limitations to raising the minimum wage. For example, retroactive job losses. What retroactive job losses means is that when the minimum wage is raised, jobs that otherwise would have been created never are. In addition, raising the minimum wage can, as discussed previously, force some small businesses who can't afford to pay all of their employees the new minimum wage into layoffs. In addition, as Divya so helpfully talked about, raising the minimum wage is not an effective poverty reduction strategy. Like I said, it can help the working class, but it is not an effective poverty reduction strategy. Finally, businesses, if the minimum wage is increased, will either increase prices to keep profits and employment the same, lose profits so that prices and employment can stay the same, or replace employees with machines or outsource to cheaper sources of labor to keep prices and profits the same.
So here we have two scenarios in which the minimum wage would be risen to. So, for the minimum wage to become $10.10, around 16.5 million low-wage workers would see a boost in their weekly earnings, and in $15, which is over double of what the minimum wage is right now, some 25, there would be an increased usage of automation, which is using machinery to replace workers, because there's more money going to pay for the minimum wage.
Okay, so our solution was that we should raise the minimum wage to around $10 because, as you've seen, as Mylan explained on the previous slide, raising it to around $15 would first of all, it would make the businesses have to lay off more people, and it would put in more money in the economy, but it would also reduce the number of employment, or the employment rates around the whole country. So, based off our research, we found that raising the minimum wage to around $10 is a decent rate.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Billion.
All right,
There are a lot of sources.
all right. So let me get to the questions. Having finished the project, Anisha, what, if anything, do you consider to be the gap in your research?
One gap would be to cover more of the limitations. I feel like we tried to put more positives than negatives on there. I think more negative would help put more perspective into it.
Okay. In what way did you improve your ability to work with a group as a result of this project?
Okay, I learned, I helped build my communication skills in order to help communicate with 5 people, and on one single Google Hangout chat, that's a lot of people to be listening to. And I learned also how to listen to everybody and also incorporate their ideas to fit into one or many slides into a consolate or information to keep it so that everyone was saying something that they knew about and that they had investigated.
All right. So what would you change to make your group norms? What changes would you make to your group norms? And how would you expect them to improve the presentation?
Okay, so, well, I think I would first, we would first go back to our research and eliminate stuff that we thought was unnecessary. And I think that in this presentation, or before we made this presentation, we had a lot of unnecessary, not really useful information. So maybe getting rid of that ahead of time and discussing that stuff before having actually made the PowerPoint would lead to a better presentation.
Okay. What is an example of a compelling argument for one of your peers' IRR that you excluded in the presentation right now?
Okay, so by not increasing the minimum wage, I feel like that would result in less. So in Anisha's IRR, she talked about how by increasing the minimum wage, you would lose a lot more jobs, which would make the economy go downhill, right? Because a lot of people need jobs, and so by increasing this minimum wage, you're cutting off so many jobs to a lot of people, and so by I guess reading Anisha's IRR and discussing about with her the employment and how it has to relate to cost and profits, I feel like I now think more about how not raising the minimum wage would actually be better sometimes.
Okay. So whose IRR made you think differently about your team solution?
Whose IRR made me think differently about my team solution? I am going to have to say I think Anisha's IRR, she had a lot of really good research, and a lot of it was very informative, especially because towards the start of making this TMP with my team, we were kind of uncertain about what our solution should be. But Anisha provided a lot of the research, like the $10 from 1968, I believe it was the peak. Yeah, the $10 being accounting for inflation, of course, being the height of the minimum wage, and then using that as a standard for what our solution should be. That is from Anisha's IRR. So my answer, Anisha.
All right, thank you, ladies.